So I wanted to make some more recap videos. This one is going to cover, probably in more parts, the first and second sessions of Fall of the Age of Magic, my little Cypher fantasy campaign. So these are going to be a lot more straightforward because, and I had already recapped these before for all the other players, so it's a lot more fresh in my mind. Because this is basically just like what they went through during the session, and it's not. I don't have to do any sort of the backstory or lore building sort of stuff. So essentially, the whole party that I had talked about last time, they sort of all came together and well, the first thing that actually happened was they got introduced to Nero, and so Nero sort of met the rest of the party, and he's like, okay, let's go check some stuff out. So they started going into the forest, and they went a few miles, through the forest, sort of just walking along, nothing really out of the ordinary, and then they come into this, huge sort of like a pond area with like a tree sort of standing in the middle. I actually have it on the map. Yeah, I do. Okay. I drew a little map, but I'll show more of it when I get to the actual town section. So essentially, they come to this place where there's like a little sort of lake and a tree in the middle, like a large tree that's clearly giving off sort of mana energy. And they notice that there are these two really large elephant-like blue-furred sort of beasts that are sort of roaming around, and they're sort of going near the tree and sort of doing this thing with their trunks, like they're like a vacuum cleaner, just starting to suck out this energy. And immediately, with some very good rolls, they immediately identify that these things are what are known as disenchanter beasts. And you can look up a disenchanter on I think they exist in 3.5, but I was using the Pathfinder version, I think, or I was using a mix of the two. Anyway, they're an actual monster that I kind of took because I was looking for something that would specifically eat magic, because I was like, the problem with the mana balance probably has something to do with something that eats magical energy and is causing some sort of imbalance. So they immediately start to attack these things. But while they're starting to attack, these fairies and nymphs that come out of the actual sort of they're sprites. That's right. I used their sprites specifically. These little sprites started to form out of the lake and the air itself. So like they sort of congealed into these sort of sprites, and they started attacking the elephants too to help the players get some backup. And so the idea was, we have these swarms of sprites like flying around that made the battle a little bit more interesting than just run up and attack these things, because now you have help from the forest itself is sort of these creatures who are basically like manifestations of the forest are helping you out. So they like were being assisted by these swarms. But the funny thing was the swarms also made it sort of difficult for them to approach because of all this chaos going around. Like they had trouble running through them and all this stuff. But it wasn't that difficult. But it was a factor. Essentially what had happened was Rinny, who by this point, had only really shown that she was sort of this timid street magician, starts pulling out these two, really small scimitars and just starts, just like freaking going nuts on one of these things. And she like cuts into one on the side, and it freaking starts bleeding because she gets like really high damage because she gets to roll twice and rolls pretty high on these first combat rolls. So she ends up doing like crits and like near crits, like 17s, which add +1. So she's doing massive amounts of damage to these things, and they're already bleeding to death. Like the one that she hits first, she just cleaves like right into its side, and it starts like spewing blood everywhere. It's terrifying. Meanwhile, the others started to try to attack. Bureg uses his telekinesis to try and throw a rock at one, poof, hits it, but it's not very effective. It does damage, but not a lot. The Deus actually, in a moment, that was really awesome. He basically runs up to this thing because the biggest weapon he has is his gravedigger shovel. So he literally just runs up and he's like, "Oh, what the hell? I'll give it a shot." He freaking tries to whack this thing with the shovel and ends up getting I think he got a crit. So he just slams his shovel into its side and does like a massive amount of damage to it. Meanwhile, Nero is sort of struggling to sort of hit the thing, and it's like bobbing around, and like he can't really get a good hit on it with his sword. And then it starts spewing, like while Nero and Deus are sort of closing in. I pulled an intrusion, and I said, well, now it's going to start spewing magic energy out at you guys. So essentially, and Rini was getting closer to it by this time too, because she had already killed the other one to the right, so because there were two of them. So she basically, this was the coolest thing ever. Basically, what had happened was, I think they all sort of deflected it in different ways. Like Deus moved his because I think they all avoided. I think except for Nero, who got kind of pushed back a bit. But Deus sort of blocked it with his shovel. He deflected the energy with the shovel, and it sort of bounced off. And one of the things I was like, well, I could technically use rules to calculate to see if your shovel breaks from the energy blast. But I'm just like, you know what? This is heroic. Let's just say that you hit, it grazes off the side of your shovel, and you just deflect it off. Like, let's just be cool for a moment here. So and I think he got a critical on his defense. So also that was sort of another thing. Yeah, Dustin was rolling like multiple crits that session. He was doing really awesome. Really awesome. It was great. And I mean, these were all like public rolls. It wasn't like, I knew they weren't cheating this time. So it was really cool to like, no, okay, well, you actually did get multiple crits. This is awesome. So, coming off of that, I think it was Rini. Yeah, what she did was basically she had been doing this tactic where she wanted to attack underneath their bellies because that was where they were most vulnerable. She thought that. I mean, I didn't confirm or deny that as a GM. I just said, yeah, sure, that makes sense, I guess. I didn't actually say they had a weak point. Like, I didn't. I told her, well, the only weakness they really have is to anti-magic, which you guys don't really have direct access to. But anyway, what she had essentially did was when it fires the magic blast, because it basically had been firing at the fairies also that were swarming around in the air. So it essentially fired it like in a spray above it and around it. So it was like this big, it's like an elephant. So it's like spewing magic energy like a water spout everywhere. And she basically does, like what she does is she slides underneath the one that she kills. That she killed, and then like a baseball player, just like vroom, comes down underneath the one that's spewing this energy, and then just like slashes it, and starts taking that one out too. And then it comes to Bureg's turn, and what does Bureg do? He's like, okay, I want to use my glove that I have, and so Bureg's glove. If I didn't explain it before, it's sort of he has this magic glove that's made of silk, essentially. It looks like it's silk, etc. But he put basically a transmuter enchantment on it, essentially so that at his command, he can transform it into this hard material like a stone. So what he does is he basically runs up, and mostly he uses it to defend his hands from like vines and traps and stuff. So that way, like if he's moving through the jungle and like there's stuff on trees, he can touch them without hurting his hands. But he doesn't like using it for combat. But in this case, he was like, you know what, I might as well give it a shot. So he transforms his gloves. He runs up, gets a crit, freaking punches this beast. And I was basically like, this is effectively like you're doing some kind of falcon punch here. It's freaking awesome. And he smacks it like right in the face, and it flies, backward and tumbles on the ground. He knocks it out. Doesn't kill it, knocks it out. Rini killed the one that she attacked, but this one's kind of just like KO'd because he hit it with a lot of blunt force, and they're all looking at Bureg like, whoa. And none of the mages I think it was only Deus is the only other mage really. He wasn't actually able to figure out exactly what how exactly he did that. So he's sort of like, okay, this is really weird because he knows it's obviously not possible for someone to punch, someone out with silk gloves like that, because that doesn't make sense, right? So he's like, okay, something's weird about this guy, and his gloves are definitely not normal, but he can't figure out what exactly it is right away. Um, so then after the battle, um, Deus found a woman who sort of came over to gather water from the lake. Oh yeah, and the fairies before they left, the sprites. I keep saying fairies; they're not fairies. The sprites sort of like went over to Rinny and granted her this magical power of aeromancy, the control of air, because she had bought that with her experience from last session as a skill. So I said, well, I'll integrate it into this session so that there's a reason why you have it instead of just like you suddenly get this, magical Sylvan power, which she has access to be able to get. It was just a thing where I wanted to just explain how it's unlocked. So she unlocks that and now she uses it in the upcoming session. But point is that then afterwards, after all that, they come across this woman who Deus actually recognizes. He recognizes this woman as his mother, named Thyla, his birth mother, because what had happened to him was that he was a child born in this village, and then he was taken away from the village by his master. So, but he's like 15 years older now, and he also has different colored hair. So she doesn't really recognize him immediately. Like she doesn't recognize him really, and so she's like, "Oh, who are you?" Yeah, and they explain what's going on, and so they start heading for the village. And this was another moment where I kind of improvised, but it was something that I had planned to happen later. So it was more just me moving things around. Um, as they were headed to the village, um, Nero was like, "Oh, I want to look around to see if I find any creatures kind of running around." I'm like, "Okay." So you see some kobolds, like these, small little dragon-like creatures, reptilian sort of creatures, like running around in the woods. And I say, well, those aren't really normally, around here, sort of thing. Like they're kind of, because they're not deep in the forest or anything. They're like really like sort of in the still kind of the safe areas of the forest. Like these are kind of monsters that you wouldn't see unless you got like deeper into the parts of the forest. And so they've been advancing as I've told him. These kobolds are advancing into basically like human territories, and that seems really strange. So they since Nero can speak Draconic essentially, he goes and he starts talking to the kobolds. We had this really fun conversation. And it was the joke was like I explained, oh yeah, they speak Draconic, but then Nero is like, well, okay, but I never told him, oh, they can also understand English. So the joke is kind of like, oh yeah, well, there's no reason why they can't understand your language if you're speaking to them, in English. So they started talking to because they found Deus and they scare his mother away. So she just starts running, and they stop them from actually going after her because they wanted to like kidnap her or something. But eventually the kobolds come to Deus and they're like, "Oh, hey, we need your help." And they tell him this in English, and Nero's like, "What? They can speak English? I didn't know that." It was this whole funny thing. But essentially they tell Deus that they need help from a necromancer because they want to bring their dragon god back to life. This red dragon who died, and the priest is hoarding these dragon parts away from them that belong to their god, and they want to get them back so they can revive their dragon, god, this red dragon. And he's like, oh, I can't. I'm not really strong enough to do that. And he's like, oh, and they're like, oh, come on, you gotta try, and you should try to help us. And he's like, no, I really don't want to. Like he essentially is like, I'm not interested. Please leave me alone. And they're like, okay, yeah, you'll help. And he's just like, oh my god. And so the kobolds tell him where they are, like where they live, and says like try to get these things back, and meet us there. So knowing that information, they go back to the village, and they learn from Thyla over dinner. They sort of get some food, and they rest up after the battle, and they hear from her. Oh well, my husband, who is Deus's father, the head priest, a while ago took these dragon parts away from from this site where the dragon fought this other dragon, and fell to the ground and died. Um, the dragon had left this sort of indent in the ground where it landed, and then he went over. The priest went over to sort of esca- ex- 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 excavate the body, and essentially only gave the kobolds like the body and the tail and like some other parts of the dragon, but he kept stuff like the hands, the head, like a few of them like smaller pieces that he could take for himself, that he stole away. And the kobolds were outraged by this, uh, and they were basically tricked into only taking part of the dragon. And so now they have been attacking the village to sort of try to get those pieces that he stole back. And Deus immediately is like, okay, well, I want to do something about this because this is my father. And he would probably do something like this. Yeah, he basically, installed these things. And so they go to plan to start to sneak into the church so that they can reclaim the pieces for the kobolds, I'm guessing, or just to stop the priest, because he seems to be, a bit obsessed with these dragon pieces, to the point where his wife is telling him, oh well, you know, he stopped coming home and all this. So they're like, okay, well, we got to check this out. So they all get different ways of sneaking in the church. Like Deus uses a teleportation potion to teleport himself into the dungeon like pretty much directly. Like he warps in and out through different places, and he ended up teleporting himself through. Nero basically sneaks inside like directly, like as in like a stealth game. He just sort of sneaks his way in, and then he steals the key and goes into the dungeon. Rinny and Bureg snuck in by pretending to be a married couple, which we all found very hilarious. Like the whole idea of, oh hey, you guys are sort of starting to develop a relationship, and now you're trying to pretend to be married. That's really creepy but funny. So essentially that's how they got in. They're like, oh, we need to check out this church because we want to be married here, something like that. And I said, yeah, that's fine. I guess they'll believe that. And Yedea basically got in by just saying, I'm a priest. Let me in. I need to talk to the other head priest. And they're like, okay. The guards are like, oh, okay, because they have guards posted at the church now because they need to defend the church. And I'll get back to them in a sec. So they all basically get in, and that's where the second session began. Like with all of them, like Deus, lights a torch, and they start making their way through the catacombs underneath the church.